Welcome to Energy Unplugged, your go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. I'm Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America. And we have a fun episode for you today. So while our typical focus is on established energy technologies and the companies already deploying them at scale, that's not always the case. Regular listeners may recall episode 204 with Matteo Jaramillo, the co-founder and CEO of Form Energy, long-duration iron air storage. I highly recommend going back to listen if you didn't manage to catch it. Today, we'll be talking about another slightly more speculative but extremely exciting technology, and one which I personally know very little about, and that is nuclear fusion. To help us make sense of it, we're delighted to be joined by Scott Mercer, CEO of Focused Energy. Scott, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
I'm also very pleased to be co-hosting today's episode with Eva Zimmermann, who is a senior associate in our Berlin office. Welcome, Eva.
Thanks.
So, Scott, I think it's fair to say that neither Eva or I have a particularly scientific background, so I'm sure we have some very basic Fusion 101 questions for you before we dive in. So perhaps, Eva, I'll hand over to you to ask a lot of the questions that I'm sure many of our listeners listening in will also be asking.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we can start with a pretty basic question, and it would be, could you maybe explain in a short and understandable way what is nuclear fusion and what is so difficult about it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in the nuclear energy space, I think there are two very broadly different approaches from a physics perspective. Nuclear fission, which is kind of what people understand better, which tends to take large, complicated molecules, split them apart. And nuclear fusion, which is taking small molecules, combining them together. In nuclear fusion, by combining small molecules of hydrogen, heavy hydrogen, specifically deuterium and tritium, you combine those molecules together, they fuse into a larger molecule and offshoot a little amount of energy, all things relative, in what is functionally the E equals mc squared reaction. So a very tiny amount of energy, of matter, is converted into energy. And that energy is what we use to harness the power of the sun. So nuclear fusion is the process by which the sun creates energy. It's the process by which the universe writ large creates its energy.
Sounds exciting. And I mean, we have had fission for decades. Why is fusion so much more difficult to do?
So fusion requires the harnessing of very, very high triple products. So temperature, pressure, and time. How do you get a molecule to enough pressure, enough temperature over enough time that it actually compresses together? And how do you do that in an environment that is stable or that's replicable? So as an example, in a nuclear fusion event, like what happened at NIF at the ignition event back in 2021 or 2022 were those shots, the temperature of the target was 150 million degrees when it fused. It is literally the hottest thing in the solar system for that moment. So trying to create an apparatus that can control that, trying to create that environment in a replicable way is certainly a challenge.
So the challenge is more with controlling it and not necessarily of creating it?
We do have nuclear fusion as well, and we've done that from a weapons program perspective also for a very long time. So we know how to create it. We just don't necessarily know how to create it in a controlled way for energy.
Okay, sounds exciting and makes it much more clear on my side. But I would have one remaining question. If we already have fission, why fusion? What is the advantage?
So fusion is highly advantageous over fission because it is a much cleaner process. Nuclear fusion does not create the same level of long-lived radioactivity that fission does. So while fission is a very valuable source of energy production, we still don't have a great handle on what to do with the waste. Nuclear fusion creates the same energy potential, if not greater energy potential, with far less environmental impact. And the second point that I would say is fusion is taking the most abundant resources in order to create energy. So we use deuterium, which is heavy hydrogen. It's found in seawater. It's effectively just a slightly heavier molecule of hydrogen. And tritium, which is created in the facility using lithium. So two of the most abundant materials in very, very small quantities that create massive amounts of energy.
And Scott, just on that, clearly a huge technical challenge. You're basically creating mini suns, and you've got to figure out a way to contain them. My understanding is that there are different approaches to doing that. Can you just describe in broad terms what those are and maybe where focused energy plays in this space?
Yeah. So I think that we have from a long history of research in the fusion space, largely from a government or university or institutional background. That started with really experimenting with a variety of different approaches to create fusion conditions. That has narrowed down into really two core approaches. One is laser-driven inertial fusion, which is what we do, where you use high energy lasers to compress a fusion target and create fusion conditions. The other is magnetic fusion, where you use magnets to contain a very hot plasma of heavy hydrogen and keep it away from the walls of the machine so they can run at very, very high temperatures. Broadly speaking, right now in the commercial space, there are many, many different fusion approaches. Historically, there have been those two major approaches that have had the vast majority of research and investment towards the ambition of creating fusion power plants.
And the magnets, that's the tokamak, that's the sort of spheric, I don't know what you call that shape, the donut-shaped design that we see in some of the larger sort of facilities around the world. So what are sort of the relative merits of magnets versus laser? I don't really, seems like very different approaches to achieve the same outcome. And could you summarize what you see as the sort of potential benefits and pitfalls of the different approaches?
So, as we think about the reputation of fusion and what approaches have been tried, what approaches are well understood from a global perspective, I think that magnetic fusion is what the average person thinks of when they think of nuclear fusion research. They think about this idea of this big donut-shaped machine that creates a hot plasma. It's, you see the images. This is kind of what a child would draw when they're drawing a fusion reactor at this point. That's because in the sort of research from a historical perspective for fusion, the laser fusion program has been run in a Defense Department construct. It's been used for military simulation work. And because it has applications that cross over from energy research into weapons research. And so it's used by weapons programs. That's kind of where that lived. Where magnetic fusion doesn't have those same kind of applications. So it's lived in primarily a science-focused arena, much more in the public view. So both have had a large amount of investment. Both have had a huge amount of research and publishing. But laser fusion gets its budget from the Department of Defense historically, and is now getting to the point where it is coming into the public view because of the results of the experiments that have been done over the past decade in the US at the National Ignition Facility.
This is super interesting. And in fact, I want to come to the piece around commercial readiness, but I think we're already starting to get into some of the questions around, where does the money come from and who is the natural owner of fusion technology? So as you say, a lot of the research to date has been state-backed, and a lot of that has been linked historically to the military. It's an interesting one for me to understand where exactly the private sector plays in this space, because fusion clearly is very high capex research. The timelines for payoff are very long term and potentially very uncertain. It's not obvious where the private sector comes in, given the less level of risk involved. So what do you think is the appropriate role for companies like Focused Energy and other private VC type companies to play in this arena that has traditionally been sort of very much state led?
in the fusion space, there is this difference between kind of approaches that are still very untried, untested, approaches that have been well researched or known, but have not yet seen scientific proof of energy gain, and then approaches that have actually seen that moment, that have seen gain. And the important thing for laser fusion is that in August of 2021, we achieved fusion ignition, meaning a self-sustaining reaction in fusion at the National Ignition Facility here in Livermore, California. In December of 2022, we actually achieved a net energy gain from a fusion reaction, meaning more energy came out of the reaction than was put in. And so as we think about the role of institutions, the role of universities, the role of government, is to really push forward these big binary science questions. And for laser fusion, that question was, can we do it? Does it work? Now that we've seen proof, that becomes the point at which it makes sense for the commercial industry to start to get involved and start to think about, okay, we know that this is a viable approach to fusion. Now let's see whether it's an engineerable approach to build a power plant.
So it's really taking it from basic research to commercial scale operations.
The exciting thing for us is that this is the only fusion approach that is over that hurdle of that scientific question. Now, we know that other approaches are headed that direction. We know that some are very speculative, some are relatively certain, but laser fusion is certain at this point.
I mean, are there still questions that need to be answered on the basic science front, or is it purely a matter now of scaling up and commercializing a technology that we know works? Because it feels like from going to proving net energy gain for fractions of a second to full scale commercial operations is a very big gap still.
So there's still a lot of technical development that needs to be done. The binary scientific question is answered. Does it work? Is answered. So now the questions start to become, how do you engineer systems to make it repeatable? I think that one of the strong boons for laser fusion over magnetic fusion is that it is a pulsed reaction. It is not a continuous requirement. So magnetic fusion requires you to keep the plasma hovering, contained away from the walls continuously to generate energy. Inertial fusion, you can think of like the world's largest, most scientifically advanced, cleanest internal combustion engine. You have a little tiny pellet of fuel, you drop it into the chamber, you compress that fuel with lasers, you ignite the fuel with lasers like a spark plug. The fuel fuses, it explodes, creates heat and neutrons. That allows you to create energy from that heat and the tritium fuel that continues to fuel the cycle from the neutrons.
And when it comes to scaling up, I think one of the challenges that has been faced traditionally in the nuclear sector in the fission space is that given some of the long project lead time, some of the capex requirements, it's been difficult for private sectors alone to build stuff at scale. And there's always been some level of state involvement, whether it's state-owned companies like EDF or it's it's long-term guarantees of offtake. So, and then one of the arguments deployed against fission in that context is that governments shouldn't be wasting limited public funds on speculative technologies that when there's wind, solar, and batteries that are already ready to be deployed right now. So what assuming that those sorts of arguments are likely to be deployed against or are already being deployed against fusion, what do you say to that line of reasoning?
As to the kind of why now or why invest in fusion question, from my standpoint, fusion is the end game from an energy production perspective. It is the sort of final frontier for energy. We started with the discovery of fire, we moved into chemical energy, and we moved into discovering nuclear through fission, and mastering nuclear through fission, and fusion is kind of the end game. It is how the universe produces its own energy. The biggest appeal to fusion is the way to fully decouple energy production from resource consumption. I mean, the idea that you can use functionally 3 soda cans of deuterium, tritium which is seawater and a tiny amount of lithium, to power the city of San Francisco for a day is quite a powerful image. And that, in contrast, the amount of infrastructure needed, the amount of fuel needed for traditional fuel, for coal or natural gas, is very, very large. And the amount of renewables that you need, the amount of sort of material production there is very, very high as well. So in a world that needs energy abundance, where people continue to consume more energy, where technology continues to consume more energy, we need to find those solutions to decouple that energy production from consuming more resources.
I think that the promise is very clear, and energy that is clean and too cheap to meter has always been the promise, and clean, limitless energy is obviously sounds great. So the joke though is always that fusion has it's 50 years away and will always be 50 years away. So how far are we, do you think, from the sort of first gigawatt scale plant being up and running, and then from there, how long to widespread commercial adoption?
So, people have always been chasing proof from a fusion perspective. It is a hard it's a hard thing to master. And frankly, from my standpoint, that joke died with the NIF results over the last couple of years. It is a very, very new world for our approach to fusion. Now, other approaches are still pushing on the scientific front. They still have time to go. Timelines still continue to kind of push out on, can we get there? They still discover new complications. Laser fusion is from a science perspective, a solved problem. So that it's a very, very different space as compared to kind of that comment. And it was not a simple thing to research and understand and develop at NIF and across the institutions researching and working on it over the last decades.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And if it's going to work, where will it work, I suppose, is the question. So are there particular regions that are doing this either from a research or a commercialization perspective especially well? I think one of the reasons, you're calling from California, Eva is sitting in Berlin, where I think you also have operations. Are there particular areas that are doing better than others in that regard?
I think there is a very high level of physics expertise required to build a serious fusion effort. So it tends to hub around those communities. For us, that is in Germany, where we have a very strong technical team focused on creating fusion target fuel. And in California, we have a laser expertise set and an inertial fusion expertise set that comes out of the physics community from Lawrence Livermore, from Berkeley, from the universities around here. Globally, fusion is becoming a focal area on a national basis for various governments. I think that as people really see the energy crisis hitting their economic growth capabilities and the opportunity of being one of the first nation states to master energy abundance, that becomes an interesting question for people to ask. So we see investments in many of the European states now. We're seeing investments from China at a very significant rate. We're seeing investments in Japan and other places globally. But it really does take a very good understanding of the physics space and a team that can start to put that together.
Yeah, besides the good understanding of the physics, also Fusion has received some funds and a lot of government support. I think the news was just out yesterday that you received another grant from the Sprint agency in Germany, which is responsible for innovations, with a lot of government-backed support, and Germany as well as the US in a bit of a political turmoil and changes. How does this affect your funding, and do you feel the sentiment against renewables of more conservative governments actually helps you?
Fusion and nuclear energy is a more bipartisan question than we've seen in a lot of the rest of the renewable space. From our standpoint, the main question is really how willing are governments to invest in top-level scientific research that keeps our industries competitive? Is a government really willing to put in the money to build what would be future supply chain ecosystems, future jobs, future investment in energy technology that would keep the country on a competitive edge? And that is a question that, if you can prove the scientific basis for it, is quite a bipartisan question to answer. So from our standpoint, when we think about the political side, we do think that fusion has appeal across the spectrum. And it is a conversation that does get harder or easier based on various administrations and their view towards fossil fuels, their view towards climate, and their willingness to invest in the future. But it is an investment in a country's energy future. And the ownership of fusion from an IP perspective, from a technology perspective, from a supply chain perspective, can change the future destiny of a country. So that does tend to be an argument that it's well received by politicians, if you can get people to understand that this is now less of a science project and more of an engineering concern.
Yeah, no, makes a lot of sense. The other thing that we were wondering when we prepared for this episode reaches a bit more into the realm where Oliver and I are maybe a bit more knowledgeable than the actual physics of fusion. And what we were wondering is, where do you envision fusion in the energy system? You said from a physics technical point of view, fusion is the end game. Is fusion also the end game for the energy transition, or where do you see it?
So when I think about the future for renewables and the stories around renewables, a lot of the story right now is that renewable energies are taking up the majority of energy growth demands on a global basis, which is fantastic. What that doesn't really show is the fact that currently, and on forward projections, we are not reducing our use of fossil fuels at all. So as we think about kind of energy growth from here to 2050, we are growing demand massively. And that growth in demand makes an economic choice. Do you curtail the growth of your economy, or do you really continue to use energy technologies that are available but might be damaging from a climate perspective? I think fusion is our way to break that conundrum from a political perspective or from an energy strategy perspective. Yes, you can have energy abundance without that resource consumption and without the emissions that it creates. That is what we have to get to. That all said, fusion sits in an ecosystem with renewables, with a majority renewables system, and provides the baseload power. It's that baseload energy that is reliable, that's consistent, that's on all the time, that is a part of an energy system that includes solar, that will include wind, that will include batteries, cars, storage, etc.
Yeah, no, a really good point. So you would say it's not renewables or batteries or fusion, it's actually all of them.
When we think about what we face in the technical challenge in front of us, we are trying to replace the vast majority of the global energy system and expand our energy production to meet massively growing demand. So we do hit these walls of supply chain, of deployment capability, of just system integration, where frankly, to meet climate change demands and to meet energy growth demands, we have to build clean energy technologies as quickly as we possibly can, in as many different ways as we possibly can, because just simply building solar or just simply building wind or just simply building nuclear fusion as we start to move that in that direction won't keep up with global demand. So you do kind of have to pull all levers at once.
Great, really interesting. So we focus a lot at the power market at Aurora, and certainly interesting to see how this would fit into the power market, but to fully decarbonize our economies, there are many more sectors which would need to become fossil free. How does fusion play into that?
Yeah, so one of the underrated pieces of the energy transition challenge is in heat generation, industrial heat or process heat, which is something that we still struggle to figure out a solution for from a renewables perspective, and something that fusion does quite well. And you need industrial heat, you need process heat at massive scale to decarbonize industries like steel production, fertilizer, concrete, these industries that are very, very carbon intensive and that require the sort of waste heat or the process heat from a process like the burning of traditional fuels or from a process like fusion. So fusion has an opportunity in the sort of grid of the future, not only to provide an electricity source, but also to provide energy for process heat that solves a problem that we don't talk about as much as we probably should.
Yeah. And we're talking about the long-term picture here and sort of implications for where it plays in the mix. But to put you on the spot for short term, if you were to place a bet on when we'll have a gigawatt of commercially operational fusion in any given power market around the world, what year would you put that on?
So our target at Focused is to deploy power plants at gigawatt scale before 2040. We are looking at the deployment of the pilot plant by about 2035. And the difference in the approach for us is that because there is a little bit more scientific certitude from a laser fusion perspective than there are for other approaches, we are further down the path towards the design of a commercial reactor and towards the operational conversations around how do we operate, how do we sell, how does an operator actually put one of these power plants on the grid.
Yeah, super interesting, and requires a lot of patient capital, or in the meantime, grants to make it a reality. But that's fantastic. And just maybe finally on a personal note, I think your previous background was as a CEO of a successful EV charging company. How did you first get involved in the fusion space? And perhaps actually just, it's an unusual one for this podcast. It's possibly an unusual one for our listeners. If you're speaking to people who are graduating from university today, what sorts of things do they need to be studying to get involved in this space? Is it fundamental physics, or are we moved beyond that and they should all be going and studying MBAs?
I think that as someone who got a degree in finance, studying physics is always a good idea, even if you want a job in the rest of the space. From my standpoint, my fascination has always been with the idea that we can, in our working lifetimes, create an energy system that is decoupled from resource consumption. We can create an energy system that can grow with civilization, that no longer becomes the limiter. And our energy system is the limiter. It is what creates climate change. It's what creates a lot of our inequality. It's what creates a lot of the onus for conflict, for war. And the idea of being able to decouple that from any resource-related issues, resource-related conflict, is quite powerful. That can happen in our working careers. And so for me, that started with, let's combine the energy system for the grid with the energy system for transportation. And the end game has always been fusion.
And are there some of the same skills that helped you scale an EV charging business relevant for you in your current role?
Yeah, I think that, these businesses are big, complex infrastructure businesses. They require the synthesis of very, very different, disparate things, everything from finance to storytelling to engineering to at least a very basic understanding of the science. And so if I had thought back from a university perspective, I would have said that in order to be involved in a space like nuclear fusion, you have to be a physicist, and a very good one. Now, as the space is starting to expand, I think there are many different opportunities for people to get involved in the space. This will be a full-scale global enterprise. It will be a large portion of the global economy. And that's everything from building factories and constructing the various components to really selling these power plants to end customers, to everything in between that creates a new portion of the global energy economy. So many different opportunities, I would say.
An optimistic note on which to end. And before we wrap up, sometimes one of the ways we like to end an episode is a quick fire round of under or overrated. So I'm going to read a couple of different concepts or ideas, and you're going to tell me briefly if you think they are either underrated or overrated. So the first one is the role of governments as opposed to, say, markets in driving the energy transition.
I would say that governments are the end customer for many of these energy products and for policy. So they remain important, but it is transitioning to the commercial sphere as you get to those proof points.
The potential for a nuclear renaissance, and maybe I'll make this a two-parter at both the US and in Germany.
In a fusion context, very high. In a fission context, starting to become more necessary.
Very interesting. And the impact of the new administration on the energy transition in the United States.
For the nuclear space, for the fusion space, less worrisome than people might initially fear.
Great. Well, thank you, Scott. It's been a pleasure talking about a topic which I think many of us probably don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about. Very much appreciated. It's been great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it was good fun. Thank you.
That was Scott Mercer, CEO of Focused Energy, talking to Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America, and Eva Zimmermann, Senior Associate in Aurora's Berlin office. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.